So Estela Zarate, PhD, Dean of the School of Education, is a nationally recognized higher education leader committed to student success, anti-racism, and equity. She brings to LMU nearly 2 decades of experience as an academic leader and scholar. Dr. Zarate's scholarship has examined the trajectory of immigrant students and students of color in U.S. schools and colleges, including the connections between schools and families and the experiences of multilingual learners. She has also written about and developed professional learning opportunities to improve teaching for first-generation college students. More recently, she has also examined school leader preparation and instruction to understand how to incorporate anti-racist and ethical leadership principles. Previously, Dr. Zarate was a visiting senior faculty fellow at the Diana Natalicio Institute for Hispanic Student Success at the University of Texas, El Paso, and professor in the Department of Educational Leadership at California State University, Fullerton, where she had joined in 2013. In that role, she held various leadership positions, including Vice Provost of Academic Affairs and Director of the School Administration Preparation Program in the College of Education. We welcome Dr. Zarate.
Thank you, Rhonda, for that introduction. So I am going to read Dolores Delgado Bernal's bio, her formal bio, but then I'll ad-lib a little bit. So, Dolores Delgado Bernal earned her PhD from UCLA as a first-generation college student. She is Professor of Educational Leadership and Administration, Interim Director of our EDD program, and an American Educational Research Association Fellow. Previously at Cal State LA, she served as chair of the Department of Chicano Studies and Latino Studies, and then as associate dean for the College of Ethnic Studies. She is a scholar activist whose scholarship bridges the fields of education and ethnic studies and whose passion is in mentoring students. Her scholarship draws from Chicana feminist studies, critical race studies, and decolonial methodologies to investigate educational inequity, Latinx educational pathways, feminista pedagogies, and different forms of student resistance. She has published over 40 articles and chapters and has co-authored and co-edited 4 books. Her scholarship and fem mentoring have been recognized with numerous awards, including the ARA Distinguished Scholar Award, Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social Tortuga Award, and Critical Race Studies in Education Association Derek Bell Legacy Award. Her biggest award is being a mama to 3 wonderful sons. And the ad-lib part is, I don't think I've shared this with Dolores before. When I was writing my dissertation, one of her pioneering articles on Chicana feminist theory was part of my theoretical framework. And I remember when I discovered the article, and it spoke to the study that I was writing about Latina girls and access to college. And several years later, I wrote a chapter about being a first-generation college student and professor. And her revised Chicana feminist theory framework figured prominently into that article. And at that point, the revised version was a collaboration between her and many of other peers my age that wanted to revisit that theoretical framework. And it also illustrates how she collaborates with future generations over and over again. And then this last year, I collaborated on an article with 2 colleagues around educational leadership preparation programs, and the plática framework figured prominently in that. So I am not unique in the way that my scholarship has intersected with Dolores. I'm merely a follower, if you can't tell, because her theoretical frameworks inform the studies that I do. And there's many of us in the field that consider that a privilege to be able to learn from her thought. So, welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
testing. John, is that working? No, it's not.
Try again.
Testing? Yeah. Now is it? Maybe it's because my jacket's covering it, and I'm getting a little warm anyway. I thought it was going to be cold in here. Any better? No.
It was working before.
Be able to turn up on here?
I don't think so. I think you changed it.
No, I didn't.
More amp. So it's definitely on. Try it.
Testing, 1, 2, that's better, right? And back, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Jennifer's shaking her head, yes.
A little more. Yeah. Perfect.
There's your one. Thank you. Okay, always got to make sure tech works. Thank you, Dean Zarate. I do want to say that we are thrilled in the School of Ed, I personally, but all of us in the School of Ed are thrilled with our new dean. She is a collaborative leader, a brilliant scholar, a strategic thinker, and she is the first Chicana dean at LMU. I also want to thank Rhonda, John, Ray, Jennifer, Roberta, all of the teams for the invitation, the library team and the international programs and partnership teams for co-sponsoring, for organizing, and really just for the invitation to be able to share my work with you this evening. And to all of you, thank you. It's so nice seeing friendly faces. I have colleagues from Chicano, Latino Studies, Women and Gender Studies, SOE faculty. If you can just raise your hand so that if there's students in the room who are interested in our doctoral program, our master's programs, we even have an undergraduate program now, see these folks. Leticia is in the back, so afterwards, if you're interested in checking out anything about our programs, we'd love to have you explore that possibility. Let's see here. I also want to do a special shout out to one of our alums who is a dear friend and a longtime mentor, UCLA professor, Dr. Daniel Solórzano. I also want to recognize a longtime mentor, Laura Theas, who is both here with us this evening, so thank you for your presence. Let's see, one more thing I'd like to do, which is before I start, as an educator at LMU, I want to express the gratitude to Tongva people who are the traditional caretakers of Tobangar, the unceded land on which we work and learn. I also acknowledge that much of the progress and development in the U.S. resulted from stolen land, enslaved African labor, and exploited and underpaid immigrant labor. And so to those ancestors, I honor their labor and their resistance. El viaje is going to make sense in a moment. Feminista pláticas is a methodological disruption is what I'm talking about. Rhonda read the full title. What I'm supposed to talk about today is this article, but I've never been really good at following directions. My students are always way better than I am, graduate and undergraduate, than following directions than I am. And so what I'm going to talk about is the viaje to this article, that trajectory that led to this article. This article I wrote with 3 former students, also former students of Dr. Solórzano, and I'm going to take you on that trip. And so there's two takeaways from my comments that I hope you'll have at the end of this, which is, one is an understanding of the trajectory, or the viaje, to Feminista pláticas as a methodological disruption. And then 2, an understanding of what a Feminista plática methodology can look like. So I'm hoping you can go away with those 2 things. Let me offer you a map of where I'm going for the next 25, 30 minutes. I want to speak about my own epistemological grounding because it's important to Pláticas methodology, but really epistemological grounding is important to how all of us approach research, anyone approaches research. I want to talk about some early paradigm shifts that open up the doors for Pláticas to be a methodological disruption. And then I'll also talk about Pláticas as methodology. And I'll contextualize this collective journey to Feminista Pláticas with a quote from Chicana philosopher, theorist, writer, Gloria Anzaldúa. But before I do that, there's two terms I wanted to make sure you know how I'm using. I use feminista interchangeably with Chicana Latina feminists, so feminista scholars, feminista theories, and then the second term that I'm using that I wanted to mention, is just, if you're not a Spanish speaker, plática. The literal translation is conversation, an informal conversation. Hopefully you'll see by the end that in practice, and certainly in methodology, it's much more than that, but I wanted to make sure people understand that literal translation. Then I'll move to a quote by Gloria Anzaldúa, who says, necesitamos teorías that will rewrite history using race, class, gender, and ethnicities as categories of analysis. Theories that cross borders, that blur boundaries, new kinds of theories with new theorizing methods. These words from 1990 inspired me and many colleagues to work to disrupt methodological paradigms. And so I believe that the Pláticas methodology that I'm talking about today is one of those new kinds of theories that she's talking about, new kinds of theorizing methods and methodologies. I said I would start with my epistemological grounding. Like Anzaldúa and so many critical scholars, I understand my epistemological grounding coming from my family and from my ancestors. I learned about the strength and wisdom of brown women growing up with my mom, Dolores Delgado, who went to high school, finished high school when I was in elementary school. She was definitely my first example of a feminista, along with my sister, Josie Herrera, who is a 30-year educator, former elementary school teacher and school administrator. My mom was that example for me, but I also grew up listening to the cuentos of my grandma, Dolores Delgado, and my grandma, Micaela Bernal, and the stories of my dad, John Bernal. So I listened to those stories, and in fact, as a young adult, started collecting oral histories. I did this before the age of digital technology, so they're all on cassettes. Note to self, I keep telling myself I gotta get those digitized, but I still have those on cassettes. And from those stories, from those oral histories and just the natural stories, the cuentos that took place in my family, I learned a lot of things. I learned about the direct impact of the school to prison pipeline on my family. I learned about the importance of intergenerational knowledge. And really, I learned to listen not for a universal truth, which was so important in my methodological journey. That those oral histories shaped that journey. And I learned, as Sherry Moraga says, to put faith in the language of the body where the word is made flesh by the storyteller. Those oral histories led me to a family history that was impacted by the racist, psychological, and behavioral studies of the 1920s and 1930s that found Mexican-American families like mine uneducable. There's a very long history of damage and trauma to Latinx, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color from research that's grounded in white supremacy and colonization. That history and the ongoing norms to engage in educational research that is objective, that's neutral, and really separated from our hearts is the reason why feminista methodologies are so needed. Some of the family members in these photos I knew deeply. Others I never met, but all of them informed my ways of knowing who they were as farm workers, as railroad workers, as seamstress, as resilient people, as complicated individuals. All of that informed who I am today and really how I engage in research. So I share these photos with you to demonstrate the kind of epistemological grounding that is foundational to feminista theorizing generally, and specifically to the Feminista pláticas that I'll talk about shortly. So let me jump ahead to those oral histories, those stories in my family led me to my dissertation research, which focused on Chicana resistance and leadership in the 1968 East Los Angeles walkouts. And the East Los Angeles walkouts were when about 12,000 young people walked out of schools demanding a quality K-12 education. Sadly, a lot of the things they were demanding are what we're still hearing today: removal of racist teachers and administrators, an end to tracking, culturally responsive curriculum, Mexican-American history in their schools. And in fact, their demands included ethnic studies, were some of the first demands for ethnic studies that we now have as a high school requirement in California, but really is under attack in most states across the country. That research was based on these 8 women. I collected oral histories from them, and they were leaders from the walkouts. The knowledge I gained about educational leadership and the stories I heard from them took me back to my own family stories. Relationships are important to our research, particularly to pláticas methodology, and I've actually stayed in contact with these women over the years. At the time that I interviewed them, my formal methodological training did not provide all the necessary tools I needed to disavow research approaches rooted in colonial logics and in white supremacy. So I'm forever grateful to Black feminists outside of the field of education and Chicana feminists outside of the field of education, and to my dissertation chair who let me bring that into education, into my dissertation at a time when that really was not done. I have a quick story about this research. When I was beginning my dissertation study, before I actually located these 8 women, I was sharing with a graduate student colleague, another student, who was older than me. He was of the movement, the walkout generation, and I shared that my dissertation was going to be about women leaders of the walkouts. And he very casually said to me, that's a great idea, except there were no Chicana leaders, it was all men. Yeah, exactly. That was my response. Like, whoa, deflate this young graduate student, right? Until my dissertation chair directed me to Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution, a 1969 book about paradigm shifts in the natural sciences. And Kuhn presented a model for a fundamental change in theories and scientific paradigms. And he argued that without a major paradigm shift, we may never understand certain scientific phenomena. And he gave the example how one scientist said to have discovered the gas that was later found to be oxygen, never saw it as oxygen. The later scientists had gone through a paradigm shift and saw it as such. So the paradigm of my classmate didn't see Chicanas as leaders. And I argued that the research paradigm shift that Chicana Latina scholars have offered allows us to see and understand the education and educación of Latinx communities differently than dominant research paradigms. So let me talk about some of those early paradigm shifts. Shortly after my dissertation, I began to articulate a paradigm shift when I published using a Chicana feminist epistemology and educational research, the first article you were mentioning, Estela. In that article, I drew from Strauss and Corbin's construct of theoretical sensitivity to formulate the now much cited and used concept of cultural intuition, which is an evolving concept that I would say is a basis of a feminista epistemological framework. So based on that early research from the women from the walkouts, I theorized how my experiential knowledge as a first-gen student, as a former elementary school teacher, my cultural history, those family stories, and Chicana feminist literature, all of that together guided my methodological approach. That is, what I did was I outlined my early, and I will now admit, somewhat limited ideas on what it meant to use a Chicana feminist epistemology in educational research. Around the same time as I published this, some of my contemporaries were also theorizing similar epistemological and methodological paradigm shifts in education. Sofia Vienes, the colonized Chicana ethnographer, specifically on methodology, and Alejandra Lenes, reclaiming the borderlands, specifically bringing borderlands into educational research. Both are journals, publication outlets in education. So these collective paradigm shifts paved the way at legitimizing analytical, conceptual, and representational tools culturally grounded in our systems of knowing. And again, these weren't yet common in the field of educational research. And they were the foundation for the methodological disruptions that I'll turn to now. So the Chicana Latina feminist epistemology kind of allowed for a paradigm shift. And then you have other generations of scholars beginning to write and create these methodological disruptions. So convivencia, mujerista portraiture, critical race feminista quantitative, testimonio, joteria mujerista, critical race feminista. There's more than I could fit on my flower diagram here. Again, the literal translation is pláticas, conversations, informal conversations. When I was a professor at the University of Utah, I would meet with doctoral students, sometimes at my home, sometimes at their homes, and inevitably we would end up around the kitchen table talking about their dissertation. And after a number of pláticas about pláticas, we actually began to realize there was an absence of scholarship that really went into detail about pláticas as a research method or a research methodology. Most of the graduate students had a need to articulate this methodology in their chapter 2. I see some of you in here who are working on chapter 2 right now. Or for IRB, for Institutional Review Board, to be able to articulate what does that mean? What is a plática? As a result of those kitchen table pláticas, one of my then doc students, now Dr. Cindy Fierros, and I delved into the literature and learned that pláticas had been used in the social sciences and in mental health research since the 1970s. The use of pláticas in what was called Hispanic-focused research emerged as a result of researchers actually believing that traditional methods, specifically, I'm not sure why, ethnographies and surveys, don't really work with Hispanic populations. And so the early research used pláticas as an entryway, as small talk before getting to the research, before actually collecting the real data, right? So mine and Cindy's 2016 article, we offered specific principles or contours to define a pláticas methodology. And we helped to begin to change the conversation on the use of pláticas from an entryway or small talk to a culturally grounded methodology. Now, since that publication, there's been a clear increase in dissertations, thesis, articles, chapters that use pláticas methodology. A ProQuest search in March of 2021, there were 234 published dissertation and theses. In 2023, there were 604. And today there's over 756. That doesn't include articles and chapters. That's just dissertations and thesis, which also speaks to the fact that early career scholars are really interested in using, and I would argue developing and expanding a pláticas methodology. Okay, for those of you who are keeping track, I'm now going to talk about the article I was supposed to talk about. And if you remember, I said I'm hoping you take two things away, right? One is an understanding of the journey to Feminista Pláticas. That's what I've said. And two, an understanding of what a Feminista Plática looks like. That's where I'll go for the remaining of my time. Those of us who engage in this methodology often get asked by graduate students, by early career scholars, how do you do this methodology? Sometimes by faculty colleagues who their students want to use this methodology and they're not familiar with it. And the common question is, well, how is it different from semi-structured interviews? The research that I just said is growing and growing points to how it's different. But I think for people who are unfamiliar with pláticas in their own cultural upbringing, the most closest thing is the connection to semi-structured interviews. But I want to share with you some contours that will demonstrate how it's different and then also share some different studies with you. So let me name 3 important contours that we really highlight and focused in the article with my co-authored article with my colegas. The first is that it's culturally grounded in body, mind, spirit of researchers and collaborators. That is, it's a relational methodology. It really is about relationships, very often, not always, but very often intergenerational, which also happens in our homes, not just as a methodology. There's a number of nuances related to language uses. So Spanglish, or not having the need to translate in these kinds of conversations. What we talk about in the article is creating linguistic disruptive spaces where language use is much more fluid. There's also cultural practices that are present. So the idea of chisme, which I will translate as sophisticated gossiping. Consejos, a sharing of life's teachings. And respeto, respect that is important, again, because it's relational in this kind of methodology. A second area is the role of solidarity, vulnerability, and reciprocity. So both the researcher and collaborator are understood as knowledge producers. And I won't try to fool myself and say that you can erase those kind of power dynamics in a research situation, but there's a clear, purposeful, deliberate approach that sees collaborators as knowledge producers. And solidarity involves reciprocity, that it's 2 ways. And reciprocity means that the researcher is not neutral or objective. And that's really important to pláticas. It is not neutral, it's not objective. And I would argue that all social justice research is, dismantles the idea of objective and neutrality. If we're doing social justice research, there is a bias behind it. It's being forthright with that bias, as opposed to approaching it as detached. And the third is the potential, a potential tool of healing and resistance. So over and over again, we hear that researchers and collaborators both talk about the healing potential of pláticas. And that's because partially of that vulnerability, of that reciprocity, so that very often researchers are sharing the kinds of experiences that mirror what collaborators are telling them. That kind of empathy is present. And so that's, if you think about semi-structured interviews, those are very, very different, right? Because very often with semi-structured interviews, we're asking questions. We're trying not to say too much. We don't want to hear ourselves on the recording, right? There's the idea of, oh, that if you say something or certain questions could be leading. In this kind of relational methodology, that's very, very different. So our article is very much about theorizing from the flesh and bringing our holistic selves to the research process. These three contours or principles leads me to that growing body of literature that I just mentioned. So back to my co-authors, except that I'm focusing instead of the article on the special issue. So co-authors, but also co-editors. So we were able to curate a space for Pláticas methodology in a special issue of the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. It came out last year, and there were over 70 submissions, obviously in a journal special issue. I can't remember, I think we had 10, we were able to publish 10 articles. But it gave us insight to some of the work that's being done with Pláticas methodology, both in terms of how it is a methodological disruption, but also in terms of how, not exclusively, but a lot of early career scholars are pushing the boundaries, are really expanding what Cindy and I published almost a decade ago. Let me quickly mention 3 articles from the special issue as examples of things I want to highlight with this methodology. The first is an article by Mayra Puente and Veronica Velez, and they merge Feminista Pláticas with GSI software and with census data. And they call it Platicando y Mapeando. Now, their study of college inequality, inopportunities of rural Latinx youth from the San Joaquin Valley, their research provides insights to how Pláticas with these 15 high school students added significant layers of data that couldn't be found in the census data alone. So the maps they created with GIS looked very different when it was just the data from the census and when it was the data from the census and what emerged from the Pláticas. So I'll give you a quick example, but it's quick. So their top map accurately overlays the percentage of Latinx in total population with the low percentage of bachelor's degree attainment. But the second map, informed by the youth's embodied knowledge that came from the Pláticas, actually added another layer to the political context, including the number of Trump voters that were voting for local policies also that were impeding rural Latinx youth in college access and opportunities. And I'm definitely not doing their research justice, so I want you to encourage you to read their study and note how their methodology yielded outcomes that wouldn't be available without the methodology, with only GIS and census data. And what I want you to note too is that they are but 2 scholars who are now merging Pláticas with different kinds of quantitative methods. A second article is by Ángel González, Roberto Orozco, and Sergio González. And they make a significant departure from much of the Pláticas work being done by drawing from Joteria studies, which is queer Latinx scholarship. And they really use that scholarship to settle heteronormativity, cis patriarchy. They draw upon their respective individual research with queer and/or trans college students. And they develop what they call queer Pláticas. They note that the original contours that Cindy and I developed in 2016 didn't quite capture what they were doing. Because when we talk about the familial traditions of Platicando and how welcoming those conversations are, they pointed out clearly for queer youth and families, it's not the same. Whether it's conversations that are laced or deeply embedded with heteronormativity, they experience so much differently than what Cindy and I talked about. So they theorize queer Pláticas and conceptualize 5 new contours that are shown here in this diagram. What I want to note is that their work is significant to how naming and centering one's queer identity as a researcher and for collaborators is the root of the epistemological perspectives that they actually employ. And their work points to the fact that there are many different knowledges and systems of knowing in Latinx communities. And the final one that I want to talk about is an article by Cindy Mata. She's a longtime K-12 educator, but now the director of UC Irvine's History Project. And Cindy's piece is methodological, but also she demonstrates how pláticas also can be a pedagogical tool. So she used family photographs aimed at keeping memories alive through the use of pláticas amongst families and students. And she notes the erasure around Salvadorian histories and California K-12 curriculum. And then Mata walks us through the deliberate process of developing lesson plans aimed at disrupting that curricular silence, but also the silence in Salvadoreño communities, particularly elders who are silent on the trauma that they've experienced or escaped. And what she says is that she demonstrates how elementary school students become researchers while centering their ways of knowing, informed by families, histories, sometimes trauma, but also joy, and how that isn't done in any curriculum that's focusing on Salvadoreños. So, I think I've actually gone over.
That's okay.
Let me see. I know. The last thing on this is I do want to note that Cindy points to the idea of silence in pláticas. And silence is really important to continue to be theorized. In 2001, there was a seminal book called Latinas Telling to Live, and those authors called these silences papelitos guardados, guarded secrets that we only share with ourselves, maybe in journals, diaries, or little pieces of paper. And so what does that mean in any kind of conversation, but in the pláticas methodology, where we know there are silences that are present. So I'm going to end how I often end, with an offering of respeto and appreciation to a few of the chingonas. There's so many more whose collective body of scholarship pushes me, pushes us to answer Ansadua's call and shift the normative paradigms by offering new kinds of theories and new theorizing methods. So, gracias a ellas y a ustedes. And QR code always for our doctoral program for anyone who's interested in learning.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, and thank you because you answered so many of my questions. You made my job easier. Thank you. So, and as soon as we are finished, we will give you plenty of time to ask questions. So don't worry. Can you talk about the relationship between pláticas and autoethnography?
Sure. I guess there's some relationship, but I would say they're very different. Because in an autoethnography, it is a mixture of autobiography and ethnography, and autobiography being centered on oneself, right? Whereas pláticas, although there's reciprocity, although there's a two-way going back and forth, the focus is not on the researcher. It's just that it's relational, and so there's not the detachment from that conversation, but the focus is still on that collaborator. So There's, I guess, a relationship in that both of those are methodologies that disrupt more traditional forms of qualitative research, but definitely a different kind of focus in of these two different methodologies.
Is the perspective different also?
Well, yes, absolutely. Perspective would be different, thank you, because as I said with pláticas, it is a culturally grounded body, mind, spirit methodology. And so whether it's connected to the researcher and or the collaborator, autoethnography can be done maybe in that way, but it's not, that's not the roots of an autoethnography.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So what are the challenges have you found in this methodology?
I think for graduate students doing this work, the challenge is, like, what does it look like?
Yeah.
And part of it is there's not one way, so I'll redirect you to the special issue because you'll see that there's different ways that it's done. There's a really wonderful piece in it by Magali Campos and Yadira Valencia. And they actually kind of go through the how-to. They were both doctoral students at the same time at UCLA. Danny's was their chair. And they have a conversation in the article about what they were both doing and how there was always uncertainty. Am I doing this right as a plática? Am I giving too much direction? Should I go in with some questions or themes? So all of those things, I think that's the struggle with it, is what does it look like? And so I do think it's important, if one's going to use this methodology, to take a look at the literature, and again, I kind of gave those numbers of how much has been published now, to see how people have done it differently. One of my former doc students at University of Utah, who is now professor, he was doing somewhat ethnographic work at an elementary school, but he was working specifically with Spanish dual immersion teachers over a full year period. So his pláticas were ongoing all the time. He was always taking notes, right? He was always doing that kind of ethnographic work, but the pláticas that he engaged in were ongoing, as opposed to somebody who's going in and we're going to set up a time and we're going to have this plática with 3 different themes I'd like to cover. That's a huge difference. And so I think the struggle is kind of trying to just get into the literature and see how this methodology looks different in different ways.
Yeah, it was really good to see the different ways that people have been using it, because when I was reading an article, I really hadn't thought of that, or I was kind of thinking, how does this work? And so that was really interesting to see the different ways. Thank you for showing that.
Yeah, well, and also I just think it's what was so exciting about the special issues to see how scholars are theorizing it. So whether it's the queer pláticas, the mixing with quantitative methods, there were actually 3 articles that were methodological and pedagogical in the way that Cindy Matas was. And so just seeing how people are doing things differently and thinking through and theorizing about it.
Yeah. So are there any boundaries or limitations of this methodology? And can it be used with other communities or in other settings? So, for instance, with Hispanic men or with adolescents?
At the end of our article, we talk about, that's usually a question we get. Well, like, can non-Chicana Latinas use this? And so one of the things that we point to is, number one, everybody wants the easy answer to that. So good allies will say, just tell me I can't and I won't use it, right? As opposed to, it's much messier than that. It's about what does it mean to use this methodology, and why are you interested in using this methodology? How does it connect to your cultural grounding, right? So it's not a question so much of who can and can't, but one reflecting on what it means to use that. So the 3 queer scholars who use it, they are grounded in Chicana feminist work, Joteria studies and Chicana feminist studies. And so the question then is less who can use it as what is the self-reflection we have to do to make decisions around our methodology generally, and particularly methodologies that are culturally grounded. Why? What is my connection to it? What is my collaborator's connection to it? Maybe you have a strong connection, but your collaborators, you're doing work with different populations, and that's not necessarily the methodology that fits. I think those are the kinds of reflections and questions that folks want to ask themselves.
Okay, I get that. My mind goes in different ways. So how do you maintain the structure in this methodology? Because as you said, it can be a little messy. And
You mean maintain the structure of the actual engagement?
well, yes, I think so. Yes.
Again, because they look different, it depends. But as you're developing your methodology, what you want to do is, within a methodology, laying out kind of the plan, the expectations, the goals, and depending on how you're approaching it, how much flexibility there are. So I've had students who engage in pláticas, but they go with some clear questions that they do want to have a plática about. That's a bit more structured than Juan, the former student in Utah, who over a year's period was having these ongoing conversation, was taking field notes. So one would say, well, that's not very structured. Well, ethnographic work isn't. But he was constantly recording, documenting, memoing himself, right? So how do you maintain the structure depends on how you're using the methodologies, the goals and the parameters you've outlined for the project. Yeah.
Can you speak, you mentioned silences. Can you speak to the concept of silences and how capturing silences is such an important part of the research process?
Yeah. I don't do this work, but Magali Campos that I just mentioned, who had a co-authored article, her dissertation was actually about the silences. So she theorized silence, and she called it the spectrum of silences. And on one end is when we are silenced, externally taking away, to choosing silence that we, and I see heads nodding, like we know as people of color, as women of color, like when we choose, that is a strategy. And then she talks about the messiness in between and what that looks like. And so I think her work is really powerful. It's a powerful beginning because she's actually theorizing silence to be not just one or the other, but lots of messiness in between. Because it's very different to feel silenced by a professor in a classroom or by a colleague at a higher ed institution, to strategically choosing silence for my own well-being and for many other reasons. And so Magali Campos is someone who's doing some of that work in education specifically.
So there is not only emotional silence, but there is physical silence.
Oh, absolutely. And part of what she talks about is it's not always verbal, right? The silence is the body language. It's not always just what comes out of our mouths.
Okay, and my last question is, what you talked about how obviously this methodology has grown over the years, but has there been any pushback? Has there been against it, or?
I think early on, when I was at the University of Utah, students were kind of saying like semi-structured interviews because IRB doesn't get this. And a lot of the IRB, our upper campus is what they called it, was the natural sciences, the medical school, like folks aren't getting this. I'm excited to say that at LMU, at UCLA, Other places, IRBs are getting it. And I think that comes from some of these scholars, other scholars, that number I gave of 700 and something that are thesis and dissertations that are going through campus IRBs and documenting and drawing from the literature and demonstrating that this is a valid methodology. It's much more prevalent now, or the pushback, I should say, is much less from, say, IRBs. On some campuses, I still sometimes talk to folks who say, yeah, my IRB said, like, no. And I tell them, go back and find all this literature. The special issue, the different articles, the dissertations and theses, because you just need to document and help hold hands to understand the methodology when you're working with IRB or others. But I'm excited that, yes, LMU has, they are understanding and supporting students in general, doc students in particular, who are using pláticas as a methodology.
Yay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to let you all ask questions. Okay, so we have any questions?
Right.
Where are you going? Oh, great. Hi.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this absolutely fantastic talk. I was curious if you could speak to the role of embodiment in Feminista Pláticas. I'm curious as to how you've seen that come up in scholarship and in your work with the theory, and also how that's like presented in the research space.
Yeah. So we use the term body, mind, spirit that comes from Irene Lara. She's faculty at San Diego State, to kind of talk about that embodiment, and the embodiment being, in Pláticas specifically, I think it is about some of those cultural nuances about who we are. I think a real clear example is with the queer scholars, because they are definitely talking about their bodies, that of their collaborators, their sexual beings, how their bodies are read by society. All of that comes into play. And I think in these conversations where there is connection and empathy, and part of it is expressing and understanding how our bodies are read by others throughout our lives for different reasons, as females, as queer folks, as brown folks, whatever it is. And so that is part of that relational component, is related to our bodies, how we read them, and how others read them.
Hello, Professor.
Hey!
Well, first of all, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us, and it's always exciting to hear the new body of work that's coming out. My thing is more of a comment, more, as somebody that used the pláticas in their thesis. I feel that being able to have that conversation with the women that I was interviewing or having the pláticas with mariachi music, I felt that it really opened up a different level of communication, it wasn't so like strict. It kind of lowered the defenses, and it really allowed us to have a very fluid conversation instead of it being like so strict, right? One of my the people that I talked to, she was like, next time maybe you could have like the questions already ready. And I'm like, no, this was more very free flow, you know. But I think it's very important for us to have those conversations and dealing with the healing of our experiences, you know, as mariachi women. You know, we go through a lot of stuff, you know, and so just even opening up that space, I think is very important. And the pláticas, you know, it's something that definitely I'm glad to hear that a lot more people are using it. But that was all my.
Gracias for sharing that. And I think, as you said, the women pointed out that they appreciated it, that having this kind of conversation. I've had a lot of folks say that asking somebody to do an interview for some collaborators is really scary, and the answer is no. But if you talk about a plática and still explaining that this is research, I mean, you're not going in with any kind of falsehood, but that it's a plática, and here's the kinds of things I want to talk to you about. It does. It lowers that affective filter in terms of for those who aren't used to being around research or who maybe know how it has exploited our communities. The idea of having a conversation, and here's some things I want to learn from you as, in this case, the mariachi women who have all they are knowledge, creative knowledge producers, right? Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Right here, Ray.
Thank you so much. This is so beautiful. I mostly have a couple of reflections and then a question. One thing that I kept thinking about is how this methodology seems to really challenge like the extractive nature of research, and like going to communities that we may or may not necessarily belong to and just take information and leave, because it sounds like the pláticas, like you really need to build that relationship with the people, right? The people in the communities, and for them to open up to the researcher, right? It sounds really like revolutionary in that way. So that was one thing that I kept thinking, and then the other thing is it made me realize that I used pláticas in my research without knowing, and so now I want to go back and read this special issue and other works on pláticas so that I can cite that and I can talk about that in my research. And then the question I was thinking about is, what is the role of food in the pláticas?
Well, let me go back, Profe Sandoval, and say, you said I went back and now I'm realizing I did, and everyone kind of chuckles. That's literally exactly what happened with my the original Harvard Ed article. Was in my dissertation, I don't talk about this feminista epistemology. It was after I filed, or maybe right before I filed, where I was reflecting on the process and putting things together. It's like, oh, wait, the methodology, the epistemological orientation was this, but didn't know it or name it up front, right? So, yeah, yay. The second question, food. Oh, absolutely. So, depending on, again, Juan, who was at that school all the time, there was conversations that wasn't always food, although sometimes he had a more sit-down one and he would provide food. But, and also, Zoom. So our doctoral students, our program is all online, and so our students are mostly collecting data, doing their whatever methods, particularly with pláticas, they're online. So that's different. But for the most part, most folks who are doing in-person pláticas talk about the importance of food, and it's part of that cultural grounding. How do we break bread or tortillas, whatever it is, pupusas, whatever it is, that's part of community. That's part of relationships, and so very, very important. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Right, we'll go right here and then to the front.
Hi, I'm Isabella. I wanted to ask, what is the transcendence of pláticas among Latina youth that you viewed over time, today's age, especially digital age, and its role or application of how this theory is being represented by the youth, perhaps like in media, through visibility, and through oral histories now, how you view that transcendence over time and its application?
There are scholars now that are working in undergraduate classrooms, particularly, say, in ethnic studies, Chicanx Latinx studies, that are engaging in pláticas with students who are doing work in the community, who are doing research projects within their own community. In terms of the digital part of it, that to me is kind of what's exciting of where it will go. What does that mean? So not digital in the sense of like, okay, we're doing a Zoom plática, but what is the product, right? Digital archives We have our archivists here. Yeah, thinking about, okay, if you're engaged in pláticas and you're collecting data in this way, what does it mean to take that and create digital archives with it? There are examples of that being done. Chicanas por Mi Raza is a digital archive that is very much, not just with pláticas, but is incorporating the digital humanities. And so merging the two, I think, is a direction that we want to go. That is based on oral histories. And I kind of wonder if it's like what you said, Sanibel, that in some of those oral histories, they were pláticas, but people weren't necessarily calling it that as they were collecting the oral history and moving it to, what do we do with these? How do we preserve these and make them accessible to our communities, kind of through digital archives? Yeah. Thank you.
I want to add a layer to the question about food and pláticas, because the study that I referenced in the introduction where we used plática methodology, it was on Zoom, but intentionally or not, I don't know, at the beginning we always said, what are you drinking today? And we would talk, I have un cafecito, me hice un tecito, like that was so it started with that, even on Zoom.
Yeah, and I've also had heard of folks that are using pláticas who send a digital,
Gift card.
yeah, what are we getting ready to do?
Grubhub.
Grubhub, one of those, yeah. And so the idea being, if you'll use this, we can both be having our meal as we're talking. So yeah, you're right. Even in a Zoom setting, what we're drinking, what we're eating, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Did we have another question? Last one. Right over there.
Dr. Pineda.
Hi. First and foremost, so grateful for your presence on this campus. I think as a person who's been here for quite a bit, we've been waiting for someone like you. So I really thank you. And two, I'm still also very salty that I didn't get to have you as my girlfriend when I was going through my own doctoral program.
We'll collaborate and
Yeah, in different-
co-conspirators in other
Yeah,
ways.
in different ways. And also shout out to Dr. Alcantara,
thank
Nicole, here in the space. But my question here is, pláticas, what a tool tan hermosa, right? A beautiful tool. And I'm thinking about its high prevalence in scholar activism, but I think on the staff world, right? And I think even in the higher up leadership realm in the world, how do you think pláticas can be utilized as a day-to-day tool for decision-making for people at the top? Because I don't think this travels upwards often.
Wow, that's something I need to think on, because part of me says to that early question, who can use it? I'll just frame it the kind of simple way, who can use this methodology? But the deeper part is, what is your connection to? And so, depending on who the higher ups are, if there's not a connection, I don't know that this is something that we want or that they should be using. But if there is a connection, how does it get integrated in ways that can move forward that kind of reciprocity, empathy, mirroring experiences, all those kinds of different contours? I don't have an answer. So again, maybe that's something we'll keep talking about, because I think it can be a powerful tool, but I also wouldn't want it imposed on folks who don't have the connection to it.
I'm ready to choose me up.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to call it a night. Just remember, all of you who have the little white form, thank you, Chris. Please take a moment to fill it out for us, and don't forget that email address. Be in the raffle. This has been a wonderful evening. I've learned a lot. It's been really great. I want to thank you, Professor Delgado Bernal, for sharing your illuminating research.